Welcome everybody to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The issue we're analyzing today is actually a question. Is Douglas MacArthur the most overrated general in American history? For those of you dying to know the answer, I'll tell you right now. Yes. Yes, he is. Let me explain why. There were certainly worse generals in American history. George McClellan, who commanded the Army of the Potomac in the Civil War, was much worse. But MacArthur is the most overrated because so many people think that he was great. There were people when he was alive, and people today, that argue he was the all-time best general in American history. It's unbelievable. Let's start with a short biography. He was born in 1880, died in 1964. His father was a general named Arthur MacArthur. In 1903, Douglas MacArthur graduated at the top of his class from West Point. He served in World War I, was promoted to brigadier general. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover made MacArthur Chief of Staff of the Army. This is when MacArthur did something terrible against Army veterans. In 1924, Congress announced that the World War I veterans would receive a bonus as a thank you for their service to their country. Vets would be paid $1.25 per day for service overseas and $1 per day for service stateside during World War I. However, the bonus was not going to be paid for another 21 years, meaning 1945. Then the Depression came in October 1929. Millions of people were out of work and were desperate for money. By 1932, with no end in sight for the Depression, World War I veterans from all over the country came to Washington, D.C. to demand payment of their bonuses in 1932. They couldn't afford to wait until 1945. Approximately 20,000 people comprised what was called the Bonus Army in D.C. that summer. The poor, starving vets and their families camped out in shanty towns in Washington. The House of Representatives voted to give the veterans their money at that time, but the Senate rejected the bill. No matter, President Hoover had said he would veto the bill anyway. A stalemate lasted for weeks. Then, on July 28, 1932, President Hoover gave the order for the police and the Army to expel the bonus marchers from the nation's capital. Although he was the Chief of Staff of the Army, Douglas MacArthur personally led the program to evict the World War I vets. If you look up the term overkill in the dictionary, you'll see a picture of Douglas MacArthur from 1932. MacArthur sent in tanks along with soldiers using bayonets and tear gas on unarmed veterans and their families. He had the Army burn down the shacks where the vets had been living. 2 vets were killed and many more were injured. In 1936, Congress voted to give the World War I vets their bonuses at that time. MacArthur exceeded his orders from President Hoover. But nobody knew this, and Hoover never told this to the press. He accepted the blame on behalf of MacArthur. All right, back to the short biography. In 1935, MacArthur completed his term as Chief of Staff of the Army and was sent to the Philippines to create an armed force from the locals. Officially, the United States has never had colonies, but we have had, and continue to have today, territories. Puerto Rico is the best example. When the U.S. defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States was awarded several of Spain's colonies as part of the peace settlement. One of those colonies was the Philippines. The U.S. managed the Philippines as a territory until independence was finally granted on July 4, 1946, 1 year after World War II. In 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines had been granted semi-autonomy. They elected their own president and were somewhat self-governing, but the U.S. maintained a military presence in those islands. As relations with Imperial Japan deteriorated in the 1930s, military leaders in the U.S. believed that the Japanese would strike at the Philippines. That's why MacArthur was sent to the Philippines in 1935 to develop an army made up of the Filipinos. U.S. ground, naval, and air forces were also stationed in the Philippines. In 1937, at the age of 57, MacArthur resigned his commission and retired from the U.S. Army. He continued to live in the Philippines. Even though the Philippines were a U.S. territory, they had an elected president named Manuel Quezon. In 1936, President Quezon appointed MacArthur as the Field Marshal of the Philippines. According to General Dwight Eisenhower, the future president, MacArthur himself came up with the title of Field Marshal. The American military has never had field marshals. That term makes me think of the German military with people like Hermann Goering. This brings us to World War II, where my criticisms of Douglas MacArthur as a general begin. I definitely think he handled the bonus army terribly, but that wasn't a military matter, that's a human rights violation. Relations between the U.S. and Japan declined rapidly in 1941. It seemed very likely that there would be war between the two countries. President Franklin Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active duty and placed him in charge of all of the American and Filipino forces defending the Philippines. Countries develop war plans, meaning how they will react if certain situations arise. The U.S. military developed plans on how to defeat Japan if the Japanese attacked the United States. So when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the top people in the Army and Navy had plans on how to react. And no, I did not forget about the Air Force because there was no separate Air Force at that time. The Air Force became a separate branch of the military in 1947 after World War II. Up until that time, it was part of the Army, known as the United States Army Air Forces. Of course, the Navy had its own planes, which were utilized on aircraft carriers. MacArthur made two enormous mistakes in the defense of the Philippines. The first was with regard to the Army Air Force. The second was changing the war plan. Let's discuss the Army Air Force first. The biggest reason for the Japanese success at Pearl Harbor was the element of surprise. The Japanese launched planes from 6 aircraft carriers and caught the American fleet at Pearl Harbor completely unprepared. They also caught the Army Air Force planes on the ground and destroyed most of the aircraft stationed in Hawaii. The complete disaster of the Pearl Harbor attack led to the sacking of the commanding officers. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel was the naval commander in Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And no, I did not mispronounce his first name. It was Husband. Think about that. So when his wife introduced him to her friends, she would literally say, "This is my husband, husband." The commander of the Army in Hawaii in December 1941, which included the Army Air Forces, was General Walter Short. After the surprise attack by the Japanese, General Short was immediately removed from command. He was transferred to Washington, D.C., and retired from the Army in February 1942, just over 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack. Admiral Kimmel was relieved of his command 10 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Kimmel retired from the Navy in early 1942. So the Navy and Army commanders in Hawaii were removed from command and were shortly out of the military because of the surprise attack on December 7, 1941. Imagine how harshly Admiral Kimmel and General Short would have been judged if they had received 9 hours warning that the Japanese were going to attack. That would have been much worse, right? Obviously, I'm bringing the scenario up for a particular reason. When the attack occurred at Pearl Harbor, American military forces throughout the Pacific were informed that we were now at war with the Japanese and they needed to be on a war footing. They should expect Japanese attacks immediately. These warnings were sent to Douglas MacArthur as the Supreme Commander of American forces in the Philippines. MacArthur personally received these warnings 9 hours before the Japanese actually attacked the Philippines. So what did he do to avoid the tragedy America had just received in Hawaii from happening in the Philippines? Nothing. That's right, he did nothing. So what was the war plan that MacArthur was supposed to follow when war broke out with Japan? War Plan Orange was the original plan by the U.S. military chiefs before World War II on how to deal with a sudden war against Japan. It was later revised to a plan called Rainbow 5. The Philippines is an archipelago consisting of thousands of islands. American military planners thought that the Philippines were too isolated because they were so far away from the west coast of the U.S. and even from Hawaii. So the plan was defensive in nature. Under the war plan developed by the U.S. military leaders, most measures would be purely defensive. Since there would be not enough soldiers to defend all of the exposed coastlines, even just the main islands, the American Army was supposed to defend Manila Bay to keep that vital port out of the hands of the Japanese. Naval ships were to leave the Philippines. If things really looked bleak, then the Army was supposed to retreat to Bataan. Bataan is a peninsula which separates Manila Bay from the South China Sea, essentially the open ocean. There was supposed to be stockpiles of food, water, medical supplies, and ammunition on Bataan, so the Army could hold out on that peninsula for 6 months. However, MacArthur argued with his superiors in Washington that he could defend the various beaches to stop the Japanese from gaining a foothold in the Philippines. In spite of their better judgment, MacArthur's superiors eventually gave tacit approval to his plan in November 1941. This was just 1 month before the Japanese attack. When the American military in the Philippines were advised of the Pearl Harbor attack, MacArthur's air chief, General Louis Brereton, immediately recommended an attack on the Japanese air bases in Formosa. That is what people called the island of Taiwan in those days. Much of China, including the island of Formosa, aka Taiwan, was under Japanese control by December 1941. The American planes were located at air bases located on the island of Luzon. That is the primary island of the Philippines where Manila is located. At that time, it was, and still is today, the capital of the Philippines. The primary air base was Clark Field. Historians agree that attacking the Japanese air bases on Formosa was the best option. If they were not going to attack the Japanese air bases, an alternative was to move the planes further south to place the U.S. Air Forces out of range of the Japanese bombers from Formosa. The military staff on the Philippines was alerted at around 2:30 a.m. local time of the disaster in Pearl Harbor. We know that MacArthur himself was informed by 3:40 a.m. After the war, he was never able to explain why he did nothing with all of that warning time. After wasting those precious hours of warning time, MacArthur finally gave permission to his air chief, General Brereton, to launch an attack on the Japanese air bases on Formosa. But it was too late. A Japanese bombing attack arrived on Luzon Island and destroyed most of the U.S. planes on the ground. This essentially eliminated American air power in the Philippines. This meant that the Japanese would have control of the skies for the actual invasion of the Philippines. This inexcusable disaster, the loss of essentially his entire air force in the Philippines, should have resulted in a court-martial of Douglas MacArthur. He wasted the 9 hours of warning time he had. As I explained earlier, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were both relieved of their commands and retired from the American military because of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Those men did not have 9 hours of warning. This catastrophe alone should have ended the career of Douglas MacArthur. I should actually be able to rest my case right here without describing the other tragedies he caused and the lives lost. But I'll go on and describe those other calamities as well. Instead of defending the island of Luzon at predetermined defensive positions near Manila Bay, MacArthur tried to stop the Japanese from gaining footholds on the landing beaches. This proved to be a disaster. By December 24th, the American Army was being overrun at various points. MacArthur finally ordered the soldiers to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, which is located just off of Bataan. However, since supplies had been distributed to so many points along the beaches, those supplies could not be relocated to the Bataan Peninsula in time. As a result, when the army retreated and dug in at Bataan, there were insufficient medical supplies, food, water, and ammunition for any kind of long-term defense. The American forces surrendered on April 9, 1942, weary and starving. The Japanese conquest of the Philippines is usually considered the worst military defeat in U.S. history. Approximately 23,000 Americans and 100,000 Filipinos were killed or captured. Usually, the commanding officer of such a tragedy is relieved of command. And what happened to Douglas MacArthur? Was he captured by the Japanese? No, he had evacuated on a PT boat about a month prior. It's true, he had received orders from President Roosevelt that he should evacuate, but a lot of officers would have told the president that they wanted to remain with their troops. When MacArthur got to Australia, he broadcast to the Filipino people his stupid, "I shall return" promise. And the reason I say it's stupid is because he did not say the American military would return. He did not say that the U.S. would rescue the Filipinos from the harsh Japanese occupation. No, he just spoke about himself. He used the first-person singular pronoun, I. I shall return. The Japanese probably would have conquered the Philippines in 1942 even if MacArthur had followed the original war plan and fought defensively with a properly supplied last stand on the Bataan Peninsula. But maybe, if he had followed the original war plan, it would have taken the Japanese much longer and used more resources, which might have prevented other Japanese advances elsewhere. And who knows? If American air forces had bombed the Japanese air forces on Formosa, as recommended by General Brereton, maybe the Japanese would not have been successful with their amphibious landings in the Philippines if the Americans still had control of the air. So, was this just a failure by Douglas MacArthur? Was it just his ego that he knew better than everybody else? It might have been more than just incompetence. Maybe it was something truly sinister. In 1979, historian Carol Patillo broke the story that Douglas MacArthur received a payment from the government of the Philippines in early January 1942. This was a direct payment to MacArthur from the Philippines government in the amount of $500,000. Now, $500,000 in 1942 would be worth over $9 million in today's money. This payment was on the order of President Quezon. The money went directly to Douglas MacArthur. He should have refused it, but he didn't. He took the money. This puts all of MacArthur's decisions regarding the Philippines into question. Other officers understood this. President Quezon offered Dwight Eisenhower $60,000 in 1942, but Eisenhower refused the money. MacArthur understood that this was improper. It's the reason why he didn't tell anybody about it. The records of this payment were not discovered until Carol Patillo uncovered those records in 1979. You can't have people high up in the American military accepting enormous cash gifts from foreign governments, especially in wartime. Was MacArthur's allegiance to the United States and what was best for the American war effort? Or was his allegiance to President Quezon and the Philippines? Is this why MacArthur tried to defend various points in the Philippines instead of just concentrating on the military bases and strongholds on the island of Luzon pursuant to American war plans? As I explained earlier, under American war plans, the vast majority of the Philippines was not going to be defended. The U.S. forces in the Philippines were just trying to remain viable until they could be relieved by counterattacking American naval and ground forces. But from a Filipino viewpoint, this might not have seemed like a good battle plan. They certainly would like to defend all of their major islands if possible, and not simply allow the Japanese to overrun most of the Philippines, except for the American stronghold on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. So, did MacArthur make his decisions based upon what was best for President Quezon and the Filipinos instead of what was best for the American military and the overall American war effort? If so, that would be treason. What about going forward? Would MacArthur make decisions that were best for the American effort to conquer Japan, or what would be best for the Filipinos and President Quezon? This brings us to the next issue. Why did the U.S. invade the Philippines in October 1944 to take back that island nation from the Japanese? Here's the simple, straightforward answer. Because Douglas MacArthur insisted upon it and convinced Franklin Roosevelt that it was a good idea. Were there people high up in the American military who thought this was a bad idea? Absolutely. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was in command of all the U.S. naval forces in the Pacific, as well as Admiral Ernest King, the commander-in-chief of the entire Navy at that time, wanted to bypass the Philippines. They believed that there was no military advantages to invading the Philippines. They advocated invading Formosa, aka Taiwan. The U.S. Navy had been conducting an island-hopping campaign. They invaded certain islands and developed them into naval and air bases. They bypassed many islands which had Japanese garrisons on them. The phrase for this strategy was that those Japanese garrisons would wither on the vine. By the fall of 1944, the U.S. Navy was in command of the Pacific. The Japanese were unable to supply their army garrisons on the various islands. Also, they could not remove those soldiers to have them available for battles closer to the home Japanese islands. Simply stated, the Japanese Navy could not get to their vast network of island bases throughout the Pacific with any kind of regularity. The goal of the island-hopping campaign was to bring U.S. forces closer to the Japanese home islands. Once the U.S. had conquered the Mariana Islands, B-29s, which were a technical marvel at the time, had incredible range and could actually bomb the Japanese home islands. Also, U.S. submarines were strangling Japan of all of its resources. When people think of submarine warfare in World War II, they usually think of the Germans trying to strangle Britain. That campaign by the Nazis was unsuccessful. The only successful submarine campaign in history was the U.S. against Japan. Japan had to bring most of its resources to the home islands from their conquered territories. Probably the most critical was oil from the Dutch East Indies, which is now known as the country of Indonesia. Formosa, aka Taiwan, would be closer to Japan and have more strategic value for the eventual defeat of Japan. There were even those in the American military that thought the U.S. should not invade Formosa or the Philippines. Just keep conquering smaller islands and set the target date for the fall of 1944 for Okinawa. The hope was to bomb and strangle Japan of supplies to force a surrender. And if an invasion of the Japanese home islands became necessary, the U.S. would have bases close to Japan to do it. There was really no military reason to invade the Philippines. The Japanese had hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Philippines. Why have this massive fight if it could be avoided? In July of 1944, a meeting was held between MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, and President Roosevelt in Honolulu. Nimitz argued for bypassing the Philippines and invading Formosa. MacArthur argued that the Philippines must be retaken. Unfortunately, the commander-in-chief, Franklin Roosevelt, was persuaded by MacArthur. But did MacArthur truly believe that this was the best military course of action? Or was it because of his stupid personal pledge of "I shall return"? Or was it because of his indebtedness to Filipino President Quezon, who gave him $500,000? We'll never know for certain. My guess, it was mostly because of his enormous ego, and he just wanted to fulfill his pledge that he would return to the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur landed on the Filipino island of Leyte on October 20, 1944. He made sure that he was well photographed returning to the Philippines. Okay, so MacArthur fulfilled his pledge and returned to the Philippines. What was the cost? Obviously, they were not thinking about any Japanese losses, But the Japanese had over 370,000 casualties in the defense of the Philippines. If those men had just been left there and had to surrender after the war, that bloodletting could have been avoided. Let's consider the Filipinos. It is estimated that the Filipinos lost approximately 500,000 to 1 million people during the 3-year occupation by the Japanese. That was out of a country of approximately 18 million. How much of these losses was a result of the reoccupation of the Philippines is unknown, but it must be presumed that a majority of these casualties was a result of MacArthur reconquering the Philippines, since that's when most of the fighting occurred in that country. And how about the Americans? American casualties, which include killed and wounded, were over 62,000 men. So, if Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Navy were right and the Philippines could have been bypassed, an awful lot of people died or were wounded to satisfy Douglas MacArthur's ego and his promise that he would return. I'm now going to skip to America's next war in Korea. I have a full podcast episode on the Korean War. I won't be so brash as to tell you that you should listen to it, but my wife and kids would highly recommend it. The Korean War begins on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops poured over the 38th parallel into South Korea. It becomes a fight between the Communist North Korean Army on one side and the combined army of the United Nations on the other. The United Nations Army was made up primarily of American and South Korean troops. North Korea overran almost all of South Korea. The situation was desperate and required a bold move. This is the one time where I give MacArthur a lot of credit. He pulled off a brilliant move when needed. On September 15, 1950, MacArthur landed 75,000 troops at Incheon. It was a major success. 2 weeks later, MacArthur recaptured the South Korean capital of Seoul. Soon, the U.S. forces had fought their way to the 38th parallel. In short, the United Nations forces under the command of Douglas MacArthur had control of all of South Korea. The question was, what to do now? The resolutions from the United Nations authorized a war to push the aggressors, the North Koreans, back across the 38th parallel. There was no mandate from the UN to conquer North Korea and unite the country. But MacArthur definitely wanted to invade North Korea. Unfortunately for the thousands of lives that would eventually be lost, President Harry Truman was persuaded by Douglas MacArthur and gave him permission to invade North Korea. Up to this point, the United Nations forces were simply fighting the North Koreans. MacArthur had assured President Truman that the Chinese would not enter the war to save their communist brethren from North Korea. The short version of the story is this. As MacArthur's forces got close to the Chinese border with North Korea, the Chinese attacked in overwhelming numbers. After much loss of life on both sides, the Korean War turned into a stalemate and ended with North Korea and South Korea pretty much where they started, separated around the 38th parallel. MacArthur's insistence and Truman's agreement to invade North Korea significantly widened the war and involved the U.S. against the most populous country in the world, China. The big political news occurred on April 11, 1951, when President Truman relieved General MacArthur as Supreme Commander in Korea. Why did MacArthur get fired? The short answer is that MacArthur wanted to greatly expand the war into World War III. In December 1950, MacArthur requested discretion to use nuclear bombs. He submitted a list of targets in North Korea and China and requested 34 atom bombs. Imagine the long-term devastation from using 34 atomic weapons around the Chinese-North Korea border. America would have become a pariah throughout the world. And what about our arch enemy during the Cold War, the Soviet Union? What would they have done in such a situation? Would the USSR have joined in on behalf of the communist bloc? In 1951, the Soviets had atomic weapons. Would this have turned into World War III with nuclear exchanges? One shudders to think of such a scenario. As popular as Douglas MacArthur was in 1951, none of the people high up in the American military agreed with his proposal to use nuclear weapons against China. and I don't know of any serious or reasonable historian who thinks that MacArthur was right in proposing the use of atomic weapons in the Korean War. Well, that's my indictment of Douglas MacArthur. You might be wondering, why was he so popular? It was mostly because of self-promotion. Nobody could advance his own legend better than Douglas MacArthur. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, MacArthur would release reports that always mentioned him and not the army. Dispatches would not say that the American army was holding out against the Japanese. The news stories would say that MacArthur was holding out against the Japanese. The American public was always reading about MacArthur's exploits, not the American army. When he was evacuated from the Philippines, President Roosevelt discussed with his advisors what to do about MacArthur. Should he be sacked from the army? Should he be court-martialed? Or should he be given a medal? FDR decided to give MacArthur the Medal of Honor. Why would he decorate somebody who had been in command of the worst military defeat in American history? It's because of this. In the spring of 1942, America's military position was very bleak. The Japanese had rampaged throughout the Pacific, and the U.S. did not seem able to stop them. We were also at war against Nazi Germany, but at that point, the U.S. had not been involved in any land combat against the Nazis. That wouldn't occur until November of 1942 with the invasion of North Africa. And by the way, my father was a small part of that invasion, called Operation Torch, as a private in the U.S. Army. In the spring of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt thought that the American public needed a morale boost. The American people needed a hero. He decided that the only available candidate was Douglas MacArthur, who, through his news dispatches, had convinced most of the free world that he was single-handedly trying to stop the Japanese in the Philippines. And that's why he kept his command and was given a medal. And it's also why so many people who have not really looked into his actual military career think so highly of the self-promoting Douglas MacArthur. But now you know the truth that he is the most overrated general in American history. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Ratings and likes greatly help with the algorithms that determine the placement of podcasts on particular apps. So if you're listening on a podcast app like Apple or Spotify, which allow for ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for this podcast. Please check out my website, historyanalyze.com. You will find links to the podcast apps as well as all kinds of goodies for history geeks like This Day in History, book recommendations, historical sound bites, historic photographs, and links to supporting historical evidence. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.